I'd like to, everybody listen up, please. Minister's wife's still talking. I'd like to welcome everybody to Sabbath services. Before we get into Sabbath services, I do have a couple of announcements. One is a personal announcement, and I'm bringing this up because many of you have been praying about it, about my job situation. When, I only work for the church part-time, and I do have another job where I teach chemistry down at Texas A&M. Well, I decided to retire. So I told them that I wasn't going to be, I'm not going to be working this semester. And I went to Del Mar to get a part-time job. And when I walked into Del Mar, they hired me for almost a full-time job. So I can't retire because I'm getting retirement for Texas A&M. I'm from Del Mar. I can't retire while I'm getting retirement for somebody else. So I left Texas A&M and I am now working at Del Mar College. As you know, I've been teaching science for the last 18 years. And what happened is I saw an advertisement in the Del Mar webpage for an instructor in construction trades. And I've been in construction all my life. I have a little remodeling company and do all kinds of construction. So they hired me to teach construction trades, which will be carpentry, framing, masonry, sheetrocking, flooring, things like that. So although I'm teaching, it's in a completely different discipline. But it's not a discipline I'm unfamiliar with. And when we have our next covered dish, though, she'll remind me. I don't want to give you all the details, but it was really interesting the way things worked out. Some of you have been praying for me. Well, your prayers were answered. So there were some things that happened that are really like So I'm now working somewhere else and still teaching, but I'm not at Texas A&M. I'm now at Del Mar. And I start the day after spring break. So that's when we'll have our first session. Although I'm on the payroll right now, we won't actually start our first teaching class till sometime after spring break. So that's what's going on in my life right now. I thought you'd like to know, because many of you have been praying. One other thing is don't forget that we do have our camp out coming up. I sent yesterday letters and emails, maps and the brochure and all the information to all the other pastors in Texas. So Mr. Geezy got it, Mr. Burnett got it, Trey Big, Mr. Salyer, Mr. Moody, some of the other elders, Mr. Hendren. So that's going to be, don't forget, the 23rd to the 25th in March. And there will be no services here, and there will be no services in Corpus Christi. So if you're more than welcome, you go to the camp out. Those of you that think camping is like a hotel room with a view of the forest, they do have hotel rooms there. A lot of people go to the hotels, stay Friday night, Saturday, and then they come and spend the day with us. So that's going to be going on, so don't forget that. I'd like to welcome Mr. Robert and Crystal. Is it Robert? Robert and Crystal Williams. I think you're from Houston North? South. Houston South. And there's so many people in Houston that I forget who's from where. But welcome and hope you enjoy Sabbath services. We're going to go ahead and get into our Bible study in a minute. I'd like to ask our deacon, Mr. Watts, to give us our opening prayer. Y'all can stay seated, and Mr. Watts will open with prayer, please.
Great eternal Father in heaven, we come before you thankful for giving us this day to come to learn the messages you want us to hear. We ask that you be with the speakers, inspire the message, and let us understand what you are trying to tell us, Lord. We know you are here with us, and we just give you all glory, honor, and praise, Father. We ask it now and turn the service into your very capable hands in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, our soon-coming King. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Watts. I'm going to turn the lights down. Some of you are going to be taking notes, so when I get to where it's dark enough to see, but still light enough for you to have notes, let me know. The darker, the better. Is that okay about right there? Okay. All right. Oh. You said something about engineer?
He was hoping you heard that.
Yeah. All right. We're going to be continuing this morning our study on pre-flood archaeology. And we have had studies in the past on the pre-Adamic world, introductory material to Genesis, the longevity of the patriarchs, early man, and the fossil record. And we have this Bible study, which is going to be on the Noachian Flood. And then we have our next Bible study, which is going to be sometime in April, probably after the Holy Days. We haven't had the schedule come out yet. Next Bible study will be on the Adamic world and how it ties into the pre-flood world and the Genesis account. So we're going to get into the study now. This is going to be on the Noachian Flood. The Noachian Flood is very, very important. The reason it's important is because it validates the Genesis account. If the Noachian Flood was a local event, or it was a mythological event, or it was just hyperbole, or if it really didn't happen, it wasn't really worldwide, then can you really believe the Genesis account? And if the Genesis account cannot be believed, then you might as well throw away the rest of the Bible, because Jesus spoke many times about the days of Noah and the flood and all of that. So if we look at the Noachian Flood and we come to understand what really happened, it tells us that the Genesis account is actually true and correct, and it validates that for us. It has important implications for the earth, because the flood was an earth-wrecking experience. The flood was not, 40 days and 40 nights, a little bit of sprinkles, the streams kind of filled up a little bit, and the ocean maybe deepened for a couple of inches, and everything went back to normal. No, the flood was a world-shaking event, so it has implications for the physical world, the globe we live on, the earth we live on, and its geological processes, because those changed with the flood. It's an alternative to the theory of evolution. Many people believe in the theory of evolution. If the flood is correct, the Bible is correct, the theory of evolution is incorrect. So it has implications, and there's an alternative viewpoint when we look at the theory of evolution. And it shows the judgment of God. We forget why the flood. We're going to look at the flood and some of the mechanics of the flood and the ark and all of that. But the reason the flood was sent was as a judgment from God. And a lot of people don't believe that there is anything as judgment, or don't judge me, nobody can judge me, all of that type of thing. And God does judge people. He sent people, millions of them, to their death because they were not doing what he told them to do. And the flood shows that God is a God of judgment. Now let's look at some of the things that we have studied in the past. Let me lower this just a little bit. Some of the review from past times that we need to remember when we look at the flood scenario. One is we are old earth creationists. And this is stuff we've covered in other Bible studies, but you have to remember it for today's study. The other is mankind is young, about 6,000 years old. How do we know that? From the genealogies in the book of Genesis. And that the earth is very old. You remember Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and the gap in there. Genesis 1 is a recreation account. The earth was created in the times past. It fell into ruin and destruction, probably through the sin of the angels and Lucifer. And then in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 and on, it's a recreation account in 7 literal days, but it is a recreation account. The earth is actually older than that week. There is a gap in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. We've looked at that. And that the Bible is a catastrophic book. Lots of catastrophes in the Bible. There's 2 that we know of. One was Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. And the other one was in Genesis chapter 6. Scientists tell us that there's been other catastrophes. They labeled them as extinction events. Cretaceous, Tertiary period, and all of those type of things. We looked at some of those, but we know that there are 2 catastrophes mentioned in the Bible. Probably more, because that's the only ones the Bible mentions. And so the Bible is not a book that is uniformitarianly based. It is a book based on catastrophes. When Jesus Christ returns, it's not business as usual. There's going to be a lot of catastrophes, including comets hitting the earth, meteorites hitting the earth, asteroid hitting the earth, sun being darkened, moon not giving its light. Those are catastrophes. That's not, what we would expect to happen. So the Bible is a catastrophic book. Fossils and a large strata bed tell us that there's been past water catastrophes. Because fossils can only be buried, can only be formed if they're buried quickly under strata and then pressured by more strata on top. So fossils indicate that there's been water catastrophes, and we have fossil strata beds and beds of strata, sedimentary rock, that indicate that at one time in the past, the earth was covered by water to a large extent. A lot of people say there's no evidence for the flood. Well, part of the problem is they don't see the evidence because they cannot see the forest for the trees. We're in a forest and the trees are right here, the leaves and the whatever, and we can't see the mountain range and all the pine trees that spread from miles to miles because the forest, the trees are in a way. And sometimes we don't see the evidence for the flood because the evidence for the flood is right in front of us and we can't see it. Strata can be laid down very quickly. We learned that in the past. And it can be eroded very quickly. Mount St. Helens and some of the other things that happen in some of our other Bible studies. We're going to continue. The earth has been through many catastrophic events. I mentioned this before. The pre-flood scenario there in Genesis chapter 1, and then the flood of Noah. The pre-Adamic world of the dinosaurs, we had a Bible study on that. I forgot to mention that. And it came to an end with a catastrophe that left the earth covered in water. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. The fossil record of early man supports the Genesis record. Man lived a long time. He was buried in caves, and he led a very violent and wicked life. The fossil record supports all those things. The three things mentioned in Genesis about early man and why the flood came. The longevity of the patriarchs is supported by science and scripture. We covered that in a Bible study in the past. Now, let's look at some major points about the Noachian flood. One more thing, I'm sorry. Scientists, like all people, are biased. You have to remember that. The problem is not the facts. The problem is not the seashell. The problem is not the fossil. The problem is not the artifact. The problem is the interpretation of it. And scientists interpret it from an evolutionary viewpoint. And you can look at the same fossils and the same strata, the same data, and look at it from a biblical creationist perspective and come up with a completely different scenario. So the problem is that scientists are biased. And you know what? We are biased too. And I told you in the last Bible study, last couple we've had, that the worst thing of all is to say that you're not biased. Because if you say you're not biased, you're the most biased of all. Oh, I'm just, I see things as they are. Nobody sees things as they are, brethren. There's three ways of looking at things. When you start talking to people about problems they have, there's their way, there's the other way, and there's a true way. And people see things through their bias. Not only church people, but also scientists. All right, let's look at some major points that we're going to cover about the flood before we start getting into it. Christ pronounced judgment on the pre-flood world. That's why it happened. It didn't happen because God wanted to change the world or because God wanted some excitement in his life. The flood happened because God was judging the world. There was things the pre-flood world was doing that God said enough is enough. And he brought the flood and killed everyone except Noah, his wife, and their 3 sons and wives, 8 people. The flood was worldwide. The flood was worldwide. Right before worldwide Church of God broke up, there were a few pastors that started to believe in a local flood. And the flood is worldwide. It was not a local event. It was not something that happened back at the Black Sea, in Europe. And Noah was kind of living around there and built a boat to get away from this massive Black Sea flood. The flood covered all the world. The flood destroyed the earth. The earth was completely destroyed by the flood. The earth before the flood and the earth after the flood is not the same earth. That's why before the flood people could live for 800 years. It was different. The environment was different. The biosphere was different. All of these changes we've talked about in past Bible studies were different. So the world is different after the flood than before. So the flood, no pun intended, was a watershed event. It changed everything afterwards. So we're living in a world that is not the same as the world that Adam lived in. The flood is a catastrophic event as opposed to the present day theory of uniformitarianism. All of your old creationists, such as Isaac Newton, William Whitson, who is the one that translated Josephus, various other scientists that are often touted in the universities, they were all creationists. They all believed that God had made everything, and they were all catastrophists. They all believed that the earth had been in the past involved in catastrophes. So the flood is a catastrophic event. The Noachian Flood was an earth-changing event. It ushered in a new world, a world that was completely different than the pre-flood world. This new world which we live in is profoundly affecting us. So we are a product of the world we live in, and the world we live in is a product of the Noachian Flood. And to understand the world we live in, you have to understand the flood, and that's why we're looking at it today. Here's an old woodcut of Noah building the ark. Here's Noah right over here, and you have the ark, 1, 2, 3 decks. The word ark means chest. So that's a lot of pictures on the internet. Most of them are not accurate. This is an old one that was very accurate. Let's look at what we're going to do today in the Bible study. What is the SPS of this Bible study? What are we going to study? What are we going to look at today? The first thing is a background to the flood. Why did the flood come? What caused the flood to be sent on the earth? We covered part of that, but we're going to go to that into more detail. We're going to look at the ark itself, some of the construction features, the dimensions, volume, carrying capacity. People tell you that the ark could not hold all the animals in the world by twos. And they're absolutely right. But it did hold all the animals that God sent. And there's a difference. And we'll talk about its carrying capacity, the volume, the dimensions, and all. How big, how much could it carry, and all of that type of thing. We'll look at that today in the study. Also, how long did the flood last? Oh, it lasted 40 days and 40 nights. No. That's how long it rained. The flood lasted a lot longer than that. So we'll look at the duration of the flood, the effects of the flood on the earth as outlined in the scriptures, the effects of the flood on us, mankind, and let's look at the background of the flood. Let me adjust this better here. Got some titles that are... Let's look at some background. Let's go to Genesis chapter 6. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 6 a lot, so we may be moving from it. So put a marker there because we're going to go back and forth to it. Genesis chapter 6 and in verse 1 and 3. This is man and God opposed to each other. And Genesis chapter 1 says, "Now it began to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God," many people think these are angels, but they're not, they're humans. Angels and women cannot cohabit, cannot have intercourse. They do not produce anything. You have in chapter 5, the family of Adam, which is the line of Seth. And in chapter 4, the last part, you have the family of Cain, which was the degenerative line. Cain was sent away. He had children. His children were not godly, as you can read about in the book of Genesis. So we have Cain's line and Seth's line, and they were intermarrying. That's what it's talking about. So we had a religious problem. Godly people were intermarrying with ungodly people. And that's what happened here. The sons of God, verse 2, saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Two ways of interpreting this. Man would live for 120 years instead of the 800, or I'm going to give him another 120 years before I bring destruction upon him. Probably the second is more likely the correct one. Let's look at the next problem. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. There were giants, or Nephilim. The word Nephilim means knocker down of bigger people. That's what it means. A person that knocks down a bigger person. That's what it literally means. On the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were mighty men of old, men of renown. Now, go to chapter 4. Keep your place there in 6. And let's look at verse 16. Mine has a little heading above it. It says a family of Cain. Now notice verse 21. His brother's name was Jubal. He was a father of those who play the harp. And as for Zillah, she also wore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. Just let me give you something to research on your own. Don't have to present it here. The god of the underworld, who lived in a volcano, was called in the mythologies of the Romans and the Greeks Vulcan. Tubal Cain is, a Vulcan is a corruption of the term Tubal Cain. If you remember your Greek mythology from high school, when am I ever going to use this stuff? Your Greek mythology from high school, you remember that Vulcan made weapons and he gave them to humans, and that caused war and all that. Notice what Tubal Cain did. An instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. So a couple of generations removed from Adam, we have people that knew how to manufacture iron and brass. And Tubal Cain was one of these people. So these people before the flood, who were very intelligent, very powerful people, and who affected the pre-flood world quite a bit, have been mythologized, have been made into myths in Roman and Greek legend. Not all of them, but some of them. You remember Jason and the Argonauts? What was Jason trying to find? The tree with the snake and the golden fleece that you put on, and it gave you what? Immortality? What do you think that's a copy of? So what I'm getting at is in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 6, these mighty men were men that have been made into myths. And so there's some of the legends are based on these historical facts. Just some little bit of trivia there. And these men were very wicked. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 and 7. Notice the problem. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. What happens to a criminal nowadays? He lives to be 60 or 70 and then he dies. What would happen to a criminal in the pre-flood world that lived to be 900 years old? In good health. How much damage and carnage and wickedness could he produce? Every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only on evil continually, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. So this was the background to the flood. This is why it came, wickedness. Verse 11 and 12, we're skipping some things. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. The earth today is filled with violence, but nothing like it was compared to the time of the days of Noah. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all the flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. There was no one, very few people, that were followers of God. Very few people. All flesh to die, earth to be destroyed. Notice verse 13. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them. Keep reading. With the earth. So the earth was destroyed alongside of man. So when God destroyed man by bringing the flood, not only did he destroy man, but he also destroyed the earth. So we're not living in an earth that's been carried over. We're living in an earth that's different. It's not the same. It's been destroyed. Let's look at some things that have to do with the ark. Let's look at some of the, this is what we're going to look at as far as the ark is concerned. Some construction features of what is gopher wood, the dimensions of the ark, the volume and the carrying capacity of the ark, some of the feeding strategies, how was Noah and his sons able to feed all the animals. Interior constructions, I have some photos of some models they have made, so we're going to be looking at that. So the first thing to do is let's look at the ark's construction features. We're going to look at Genesis chapter 6, you should be there, verse 13, verse 14 actually. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits. So we know what a cubit is. We multiply that by 300, so that's how long it was. Its width 50 cubits, 50 times whatever a cubit is. And its height 30 cubits. Cubit would be like a yard or like a foot or like a meter. It's just a unit of measure. And its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark on its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. So let's review what the ark was going to look like. The word ark means chest or box. You remember the Ark of the Covenant? Just a box that Moses put the 10 Commandments in, and the manna, and the rod that budded, And the Israelites carried it with rods and went through it in rings, and they carried it. It was just a box. So ark doesn't mean boat. It doesn't mean, ship. It means box. So the ark had a rectangular shape, a box shape. That's why it was called a box or a chest. It didn't have a prow. It didn't have a stern. It didn't have a bow where it had to cut through the water because it wasn't going anywhere. It just had to float. So it was a floating chest or floating box. The ark had 3 stories, first, second, and third decks. It had a window. It doesn't say that the window was a cubit. It says the window was a cubit from above. So whatever the top of the ark was, from a cubit below that, there was a window. The window probably ran the length of the ark for ventilation. You look at some of these old barns, they have a window at the very top. You put on a roof at your house, you have venting, or the main thing now is at the tip of the house, you have these roof vents, and they sit right at the apex of the house. And because of the way they are and the vents that you have on the side of the house, they ventilate out the top of the attic. The ark probably had things like that. Noah was not a dummy. Noah was a very intelligent person. So he knew all about how to build things. Covered inside and outside with pitch, which is bitham or tar. Commonly found all throughout the Middle East and Asia in seeps coming up out of the ground. The ancients used it to set teeth. They did dentistry. One of the things that I mentioned last time about some of the early man fossils, which supposedly show evolution has occurred, and these were very backwards people. Some of the teeth on some of these skulls had dental work done on them. And what the ancients did is they would use pitch to stick teeth together. You broke off your teeth, they'd make you a fake tooth, and they would stick it on there with tar. They also made bathroom tubs and sinks out of bitham. It would get really hard, and they would shape it and warm it up, and they would shape it, and it got hard, and it was used often as sinks. And they would also cover wood and laminate wood with bitham. What do you call wood that's laminated when you go to Home Depot? Do you say, let me have some laminated wood? What do you call that?
Plywood.
Plywood. Wood that's glued together in layers. The ark had rooms or stalls or compartments or nests depending on which translation you use. So the ark was not a zoo. The ark was a floating survival barge. And if you read about the ancient Romans, the beastmasters that would go over to Africa to get animals to bring them back to the Colosseums, where they would be, used in fights, lions and giraffes. They slaughtered all kinds of animals. There was a whole trade where there were people from Rome and Italy that would go to Africa on boats, go into the jungles, capture these animals, and bring them back. And there was a technique they used to bring all these animals back. And one of them was they would put the animals in small enclosures. When you put the animal in a small enclosure, not a big cage, but a small enclosure, about maybe twice the length and twice the width of him, they would hibernate. So there's all kinds of things that we don't consider when we look at the rooms and the stalls and the compartments or the nests that were used in the Ark of Noah. It was constructed of gopher wood. I want to figure out a little bit what gopher wood is. Let's look at gopher wood first of all. Let's look at verse 14. It says, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch. I'm reading out of the New King James. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. This is 1613, Strong's word for gopher. Make a cover or pitch it. The King James says make an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and pitch it with inside and outside with pitch. The word cover or pitch is this word here, and then the word pitch is that word there. Now this is going to give us some indication of what gopher wood was. Here is gofar, this word right here, 1613. Here is kafar, which is the word for cover, 3722, how you pronounce it. Here's kofar, which is pronounced like that, 3724. It's interesting, the word gopher, kafar, and kofar, all are spelled almost identically in the Hebrew. There's a Hebrew symbols for it, pronounced almost the same. The word here, kafar, 37:22, is the same word used in Leviticus 16, where it says, you shall make an atonement for the people. Remember, Leviticus 16 talks about the goat that dies and the goat that lives and the hand of the fit man and all of that. It occurs on the Day of Atonement. That word kafar is where we get the word yom kafar from. Kafar means, yom means day. Kafar means purge, pitch, atonement, cover with pitch. So the word gofar is a word that in other places means to cover it with pitch or to make an atonement for. Yom kippur, kafar, being this word right here with the word day in front of it. Now, let's look at some other things. This is asphalt or pitch is a covering, cover with pitch. Some people say this is cypress. Some people say it's all kinds of different woods. This is the only place in the Bible where this word is used, gofar wood. There is a word in the Bible for cypress, and it is used in the Bible. So it's not cypress. A lot of people think it was cypress because cypress is very water tolerant and all that. Some think it was cedar, some think it was something else. It was gofar wood. Now let's consider some things. Older dictionaries will provide insight into the word gofar. This was written in the 1600s, King James English. The word wafer, gopher, gofar, all deal with related concepts. Definitions include layers in a wafer, layers glued together, an adhesive to glue together layers of paper, and layers of lace in women's clothing. The concept of layering and lamentation is implied in all of these words. The term goffering comes from an old French word, which is a process whereby irons are used to flute and press together various layers of lace. You see these old dresses with all kinds of lace on them? That's called goffering. The early French settlers in the United States named rodents, gophers, that burrowed in the earth and created layers of honeycombs, gophers. So the word gofar, or gofar, means layered. So we can translate that into layered wood. So gofar wood is not some tree from a gofar tree. Gofar tree is wood that has been layered. And it was layered with what in it?
Pitch.
Pitch. So when we have layered wood and we pitch it together, we do what Mr. Perdue said. We create plywood. The Bible reveals that Noah's Ark was covered inside and outside with pitch. This would serve as a waterproofing agent. The pitch covering was probably natural bithyme that was commonly found in seepages in the Middle East. But what many people do not realize that the ark's design would have also included laminated or layered wood that was glued together with resinous tar-like coating. This manufactured glue was expressly produced for the lamentation of wood and was well known throughout the ancient world. The ancients were extremely intelligent, brethren. They made the pyramids, which we can't make now. Well, how did they make them? They didn't have iron tools. They had all of those things. They had saws that would cut through stone. This lamentation would provide strength for the large beams required for the construction of the ark. As shown, gopher wood was actually a process in which the ark's wood was laminated and glued together with pitch and resin, a type of ancient plywood. So gopher wood was not a tree. Gopher wood was a type of wood. So when you read gopher wood in the Old Testament, only one place, think of the word laminated, pitched together wood, which in our vernacular we call plywood. A lot of people say, oh, the Noah's Ark wasn't strong enough, the wood would break up. It was made out of laminated wood, plywood. So it's extremely strong. Some of our, back in the early 1900s, some of our battleships and destroyers were made out of plywood. The hulls were. The ark and the dimensions. Let's look at the dimensions of the ark. This is a model of the ark that I have. I've given a seminar on Noah's Ark, probably in about 150 different church areas. Here's a model of the ark I have. I didn't bring it today because it's pretty big. Here's a model of a railroad stock car. Notice the size of the car, the railroad stock car, to the size of the ark. This is a model of the Pinta, one of the ships that Columbus came to the New World in. They're all to the same scale. Now, Genesis chapter 6:15, let's read that. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. So, the length 300 cubits, width 50 cubits, height 30 cubits. If we know how long a cubit is, we know how long and how big and how wide the ark was. There were two types of cubits used in the ancient world. The one was a Hebrew cubit, which is about from here to here, and it was about 18 inches long. foot and a half. The other was the Egyptian cubit, which is 24 inches long. Some people say that that the book of Genesis was edited by Moses. And Moses was a prince of Egypt. He would use the Egyptian numerology. So some think that if Moses edited the books of Genesis, which we may have, that the cubit was probably the Egyptian cubit. All of the dimensions I'm giving you are based on the 18-inch cubit. If it was the 24-inch cubit, then the ark would be 25% bigger, longer, more volume, and all of that. So I'm giving you all these dimensions based on the smaller cubit, which is 18 inches long. The ark would be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, that should be feet, and 45 feet high. 300 times 1.5 is 450. 350 times 1.5 is 75. 30 times 1.5 is 45. So this would be the length of the ark and the width and the height in feet.
Conservatively.
Mm-hmm. Once again, if the ark was made on a 24-inch cubit, then it would be 600 feet long. Now, here's the thing. The 350, the length and the width, which is a 1:6 ratio, is the same ratio that all ships use that are manufactured today. If you go to a marine architectural book, the best design with the length for ocean-going vessels and barges is 1:6.
Most stable.
Most stable. Most stable. And they estimate that the ark could probably take waves that were maybe 200 or 300 feet high. Okay. The volume of the ark, the carrying capacity. There's the dimensions of the ark. If the cubit is 18 inches, then we have a conversion that gives us the following. The volume of the ark, length, width times height, 450, 750, 75 to 25, is 1.5 million cubic feet. That's a lot of space. A lot of people say the ark wasn't big enough. I'm going to show you the ark was big enough. How? Just look at the statistics and the mathematics of it. The deck area. How much surface area do we have on the 3 decks? Well, we had 3 decks, and each deck was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 101,000 square feet of decking area, which is about the size of 21 college basketball courts. So you could carry a lot of stuff in the ark. It wasn't a boat, it was an ocean-going vessel. Now, let's look at the ark's carrying capacity. How many mammals or how many animals could the ark carry? I'm going to get later on into what type of animals that were in the ark. But the ark took on air-breathing, all in whose nostrils is the breath of life, land-living animals. What do we call air-breathing, land-living animals? We call them mammals. The Pleistocene epoch, which is about the time the ark occurred, was the largest extinction of land-living mammals that had ever occurred. So it kind of ties in there. But let's look at how many mammals the ark could carry. There's horses and there's rabbits, and they're going to take up different amounts of space. But most scientists believe that the average mammal is about, the largest estimation is about the size of a sheep or a large dog, and the smallest is about the size of a rabbit. So somewhere between a sheep and a rabbit is our average. So I'm going to take the sheep, the largest there is. And notice I'm using the 18-inch cubit, which is the smallest ark there is. So I'm using the largest estimation for the mammals and the smallest ark that there can be, according to the dimensions we're given. Now, a small sheep requires approximately 11.125 square feet of storage. That's how much it requires. Therefore, if we know how many animals there were on the ark, we can determine what percentage of the ark space was required. So if each animal was about the average, some bigger, some little, was about the size of a sheep, how many sheep-sized animals can we get on the ark if we know its volume? Each animal takes that much space. Let's look at how many animals were carried. First question we have to ask is, were all of the animals on the ark? In other words, they say you had the snakes on there, you had the porpoises, you had the penguins. How'd you get the whales on there? You know, how'd you get the penguins? Those are all marine animals, brother. They don't live on land. Let's go to Genesis chapter 16, chapter 6, verse 17. And behold, I myself am bringing the flood waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. So if you breathe, you better be on the ark. Which means, did Noah have to take any fish? Nope. Now notice what else it says. All flesh, which is the breath of life, everything that is in the earth shall die. So if you have the breath of life, like a porpoise, but you lived in the water, would you be in the ark? If you're a penguin and you lived almost all your life out at sea, because penguins live for years out at sea. Lots of marine birds live out at sea. So large percentage of the animals would not have to be in the ark. So if you say every animal that exists by twos had to be in the ark would sink, you're correct. But here's the thing, not every animal in the world was on the ark. They were sorted by three factors. One is air breathing, the other is land living, and the other is, notice down in verse 20. Of the birds after their kind. So it's not by species. You have dogs. You have the pit bull. You have the chihuahua. You have the collie. They all have the same genetic material. They can all intermate. And the scientific definition of species is they can mate and produce offspring. So kind, that's a biblical definition for kind. In the Bible it says that, after their kind. Species in the scientific realm is a very vague concept. And there may be hundreds of animals in a species when there's only one biblical kind. Wolves, so if you were going to take, for example, the dog kind, can wolves and dogs intermate? Yeah, so they're the same kind. Coyotes and wolves and dogs, yep, they're the same kind. You get hybrids, but they're the same kind. So all the dogs in all the world and all the coyotes and all the canids would be represented by two animals. So they were sorted by kind. So we have air breathing, land living, animals sorted by kind. We also base our calculations on 4 different occupancy estimates. In other words, we're going to look at 4 different amounts of animals and see how much of the ark they take up. All right? I have, for the sake of being too large, estimated about 40,000 animals were on the ark. 40,000 sheep-sized animals were on the ark. The second estimate is of Whitcomb. You've heard of the book, The Genesis Flood? Whitcomb and Morris, classic back in the 70s and 80s. They estimate about 35,000. There's another author, name is Woodmore. He did a very excellent book called The Noah's Ark, a feasibility study. He estimates 16,000 and 2,000. So we have 3 estimates: 40,000, 35,000, 16,000, and 20,000. Okay? The 16,000 is the biblical kind being equivalent to the rank of genus. The 2,000 is based on the biblical kind being equivalent to the rank of family. You've got species, genus, family, and all of that. So depending on which division you use. Let's look at how these line out. If you have 40,000 animals, my estimate, and each animal is the size of a sheep and requires 11.125 feet, that's how many square feet, how many cubic feet you need. We take the cubic feet we need, and this is the amount that we got, times 100, we got 29% of the ark's capacity. So if you've got 40,000 sheep-sized animals, you've got about a third of the ark being used, which means all of the animals would fit on one deck. The ark was too big, brother. 35,000 animals. Each one at 11.125 sheep-sized. That's how many cubic feet we have. That divided by what we have times 100 gives percent is 25%. So Whitcomb and Morris, Genesis Flood, be about 25% of the ark, less than a deck. A deck would be 1/3, so 33%. Whitcomb, Woodmore, 16,000. And we got this divided by that times 100 gives us 11.7%. This is if the kind is the taxon genus. You have species, genus. That's about 12%. That's hardly anything. If we got 2,000, there's 2,000. There's our calculations times 100. 1.4%. Couple of things to consider. This is based on an ark with an 18-inch cubit. The percentages would be a lot lower by a factor of 3 probably if you looked at a 24-inch cubit. In other words, if the ark instead of being 450 feet long was 600 feet long, you're going to have less cargo space being used. And so these numbers would be smaller. These numbers here, the 1.4, 11, and all of that, they would be smaller. Now another thing, we're looking at sheep-sized animals, right? What if the average size was the size of a rabbit? How much less space would a rabbit use? So we've used the smallest ark we can, and the most animals we can, and the largest animal that we can use, and we come up with about a third of the ark's capacity. So just doing the math, the ark was way too big to carry sheep-sized animals that were sorted by air-breathing, land-living kinds. Okay? So remember that. The fish weren't on the ark. The porpoises weren't on the ark. You know, the blue whale wasn't on the ark. The dinosaurs weren't on the ark because we're not young earth creationists. So the ark really had a lot of capacity. Let's look at some common ways of looking at this. Here's a railroad stock car. You remember the picture I showed you before, the little railroad stock car standing on top of the ark? This is 44 feet long. Railroad stock car, capacity 2,670 cubic feet. The ark's volume was 1.5 million cubic feet, which is equal to the volume of 569 of these guys. If you took 569 stock cars, which is what it would take to fill the ark, it would be a train 5.5 miles long. You ever been in a railroad station crossing and the train's going 30 miles an hour? 30 miles an hour, it would take you double the 5.5. Take you 11 minutes for the railroad capacity and stock cars to pass you that were on the ark. That's a lot of space. So there was space for food, there was space for water, there was even space for people. You remember Abraham talking to the two angels and to the other angel, supposedly Christ, and he said, what if there's only 50? Will you save the city for 50? Yes. What if there's only 40? Yes. He couldn't even, they didn't even get down to 10 righteous people. So Noah went around preaching. If other people would have wanted to come on the ark, there was space for them. But what happened? How wicked was the world? Nobody wanted to come on the ark. Let's look at another factor. This is a FedEx truck right here. FedEx truck. Kenworth tractor trailer. Tractor trailer rig is 60 feet long. This is a carrying capacity, 3,282 feet. The ark would carry the same amount of cargo as 464 of these trailers. If you put them in a convoy with a 10-foot space between the truck, the convoy of trucks, Kenworth trucks, that would fill up the ark would run for 6 miles. If one of these rigs passed you every second, it would take almost 8 minutes for the convoy to go by. That's how much capacity the ark had. The ark was not a little bitty boat, brethren. The ark was huge, even when you look at the conservative figures. Here's a 1985 Ferrari 308. Like that car. About 14 feet long. The ark could carry inside of it, you know, all jammed together, 5,140 of these. We take the cubic space of this and we divide it into the 1.5 million cubic feet. So we can get 5,140 of these into the ark. If this amount of cars were bumper to bumper on the highway, there would be a line of cars almost 14 miles long. We put 4 people in the cars. When we put them in the ark, we got 20,560 people in the ark, in the Ferraris, jammed in there. That's a lot of space, brother. So one of the things I want you to know when you read the Bible and you read this, you know, we all have this picture of this little bitty boat, because we get it from TV programs and children's books, that we got this little bitty boat, and we got, you know, the giraffe's head sticking out of the front of the ark, and everybody's crammed in there. There was plenty of space in the ark, probably too big. Noah overkill. How did Noah feed all the animals? Here's some of the models that are used. Here's a model I made of feeding platform for animals like rabbits and small dogs. You put them in the cage here. Right here, there's a bamboo pipe. It runs into there and fills up the bowls. Right here, you have some slats. A lot of people talk about the dilemma of the dung when they talk about the ark. What did Noah do with all the dung? A couple of things. Animals are mainly hibernating, so they're not eating as much. But if they were eating just as much as they normally ate, they would put these little slanted boards here, and there's a trough here, and then they would push the dung overboard. That's what they did in many of the places where they housed animals back in the 1800s. Using shovels, axes, regular wooden implements, these were built and used. And they would stack these on top of each other. So in a small space, you can have lots of animals. All right? And then back in the back, you can't see it, but there's food chutes back here. And you would load the food in there before the flood began. So through the flood, the animals would mainly self-feed, self-poop, self-water. Very little interaction needed by Noah and his crew. I have read articles that say that one person can take care of 5,000 farm animals if they're in these type of structures. So if you've got 8 people, and each person can take care of 5,000 animals, all the 8 people could take care of the 40,000 animals easily. What if you only had 20,000 animals? They'd have lots of time off. So the ark was too big, and there was techniques to feed and water these without too much human interaction. Noah was, we have this concept that Noah was some poor guy running around in a robe with sandals on. And the book of Josephus says that Noah was one of the most important personages in the pre-flood world. Very intelligent. Here's a cross-section of the ark that I made. You'll see here some of the cages. This is my concept. Over here, you have a human being. That's about a 6-foot human being. You had 3 levels, 1, 2, 3. This is with cages. I made another one later on. And I put in those caging systems that we talked about a while earlier. A cistern right here. They would load the cistern before the flood with water. Had bamboo pipes, and it would self-water the animals. The ancients used pipes quite frequently. The ancients had hot water. The ancients had cold water. They had commodes. They had all these things that we think that were just invented. In the last couple of centuries, especially the Middle Ages, when the great church was in power, knowledge and information was lost, and it was really the Dark Ages. Here's another picture. Here's the window. Here's a window going all the way down, and it's 1 cubit from the top. First, second, and third decks, covered inside and outside with pitch. And I have models of these. One day I'll bring them, maybe in our next Bible study in a couple years, I'll bring them and set them up. The duration of the flood. 40 days and 40 nights. Let's look at Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. Genesis chapter 7. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. All right? So we have the flood beginning on Noah's 600th year, the 2nd month of his life, on the 17th day of the month. That's when it began. And it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And notice something. Let's just keep reading. Verse 13. And the very same day Noah and Noah's sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of the sons who were with him, entered the ark. They and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, not by species, not by genus, not by family, but by kind. Which means we only have to have 1 dog in there. We only have to have 1 pigeon in there. 2 pigeons, but 1 pigeon type. And actually there was 7 of those. The clean animals were by 7s, the unclean by 2s. Why did we have the odd number? 7 is an odd number. What did Noah do after he got off of the ark? he sacrificed of every clean animal. So he would have an extra one to sacrifice from. Verse 14, they and every beast after their kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and on every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark to Noah 2 by 2 of all flesh, which is the breath of life. So living on the earth, breath of life by kind. So those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. So we have hills, and the hills were covered. Remember, we're covering hills at the beginning of the flood. The waters prevailed 50 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. Now we have mountains mentioned second. And all flesh died. What kind of flesh? Did the fish die? No, it says, all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was a breath of life, a breath of the spirit of life, all that was on dry land died. So the animals that died were mammals that lived on land. The porpoises didn't die. The penguins that were in the water didn't die. The amphibians didn't die. The crocodiles didn't die. Those all survived. So most of these animals would not have to be on the ark, just the mammals. Let me keep reading. Verse 21. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all of whose nostrils was a breath of the spirit of life, all that was on dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, not in the sea, both man and cattle, creeping things and birds of the air that were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those that were with him in the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So for 40 days it rained. Then for another 150 days, the earth was covered by water. Totally. Okay? That's not how long the flood lasted. That's just how long the waters were on the earth. Now, we started with the flood in the 600th year, 2nd month, and 17th day of Noah's life. Let's look at when it ended. Go to Genesis chapter 8, verse 13 and 14. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the 1st month, that the waters were dried upon the earth. And Noah removed the covering and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. So on the 1st month he looked out, there was dryness, but still some water. On the 2nd month, everything was dry. So how long is that between the flood? The flood experience lasted for 1 year, 600 to 601, and 10 days. 2nd month, 17th, 27th, that's 10 days difference. So for a year and 10 months, Noah was in the ark. And it says that Noah was in the ark for 7 days before the flood started. So you can add another 7 days to that. But the flood actually started at that time in Noah's life. And so for a year and 10 days, Noah was in the ark. It wasn't for 40 days and 40 nights. How long of this time did it rain? 40 days. How long was the earth completely covered over by water? For 150 days. Then some of the water started to abate. All right? So the earth was covered by water. The earth was covered by water for at least 150 days. That profoundly wrecked the earth, brother. Now, you got something that's covered by 60 feet of water for 150 days. When the water comes back off, it's not the same. Effects of the flood on the earth. Effects of the flood on the earth. What happened to the earth because of the flood? Now we're going to look at what happened to the earth, and we're also going to look at what happened to man and the biosphere. But the first part is the flood's effect on the earth. Let's go to Psalms 104, verse 8. Keep your place there. And Genesis 6 will probably be coming back. Psalms 104. Psalms 104. And notice something very interesting in Psalm 104. This is talking about the flood. Verse 5. You who laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever, you who covered it with the deep as with a garment. Talking about the oceans. Where is, a lot of people say, well, where's all the water that Noah went through? Where's all this water that's covering the earth? Remember the forest for the trees? Consider some things. Verse 6. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. When did that happen? At the time of Noah. When it says the mountains were covered by 15 cubits full of water. If you level the earth, brethren, if you level the earth is completely level. Technically, if it wasn't for water surface tension, you could cover the earth with a drop of water because it would spread out all over all the earth. So a few gallons of water would cover all of the earth. So if you got all of the water that's in the oceans now, in the lakes and the streams and the rivers, and you flattened the earth so it was a perfect sphere, the earth would be covered with about 2 miles of water. So there's plenty of water to cover the earth with 15 cubits. You just got to do a little rearranging. Let's look at what happened. Verse 7, at your rebuke they fled, at the voice of your thunder they hastened away, talking about the waters and the mountains. They went up over the mountains, they went down into the valleys. You got a little marginal note in there? Mine says, the mountains rose up, the valleys sank down. So what happened is the mountains rose and the valleys sank down, and where would the water go? Into the basins. So the water of the flood is what is filling up the earth now. But people say, where's all this water? It's all around us, brethren. We don't see it. We don't, because we're not thinking this way. So the flood waters are now what is filling up the ocean basins, the salt water. A couple of other things to consider. Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 10. We're looking at the effects of the flood on the earth. Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And people read this about Peleg and they say, oh, this is when, the plate tectonics took place and we had all the continents, literally moving away from each other. They kind of cracked there in Africa and the Americas. This is not referring to the continents moving, brethren. The word Peleg means water. A pelagic bird is a bird that lives in the water. So the word Peleg, and I think I gave a sermon on it, or a sermonette. The word Peleg means division by water. So what happened? The flood comes. The flood denudes all of the earth of its greenery. The earth is covered by water, which is very reflective. So the sunlight strikes the earth and is reflected back up, because now all of the earth is covered by water. The earth begins to cool down, and we have ice caps that are formed right after the flood. That's where the ice caps came from. Changed the world. There was no ice caps in the world before the flood. So the ice caps are now formed. And then what happens is, over time, global warming, the earth is warming up. Naturally, it's been warming up for thousands of years. And so what happens to the ice caps? They begin to melt. As the ice caps melt, the ocean levels start to rise. Now, if you look at Peleg here, it says at this time was the earth divided. This is, if you look at who married who and who had what children and how old they were, Peleg is born 102 years after the flood. So it says 102 years after the flood, the earth is going to be divided pelagically. That's what Peleg means. That means by water division. So as the ice caps are melting, the water's rising up, and you have the Bering Land Strait between Alaska and the Soviet Union buried underwater. People migrate over that, water rises, migration route is cut off. If the water had risen another 30 feet, the Isthmus of Panama would not be there. South America and North America would be divided. How did all the animals get to Australia? The waters rose up, Australia was cut off from the mainland. New Zealand was cut off from the mainland. Everybody with me? So what happens is, one of the things that happened during the flood is the ice ages came, and God tells everybody, you need to move now. Why did he tell them right after the flood? They were building the Tower of Babel, remember that? And he tells them, you need to move. You need to go to different parts of the earth. And they didn't want to. They said, no, we're going to follow Nimrod here and be here with this big tower that's made out of baked clay, baked bricks, so that water will not erode it and we can climb to the top if there's ever another flood. They were doing that to God. You're not going to get us with another flood. And God wanted them to move because he wanted them to colonize the earth, because if they waited too long, the sea levels would rise and they would not be able to go over the Bering Land Straits and get into New Zealand and get into Australia and get into various other places. And so what did God do since they weren't going to move? Confounded their languages. So then they had to move. They didn't get along with anybody because their languages were different. So it forced them to move. The reason that this happened was because the sea levels were rising. So the sea levels rising and the ice ages occurred was one of the effects of the flood. So the sea levels rose up and divided the continents, which affects humanity, and we'll get to that in a minute. Genesis chapter 8, verse 3. Let's look at that. Genesis chapter 8, verse 3. This is right after this is in the course of the flood. You remember we read in verse 24 above it about the waters being on the earth 150 days? Now, if you live inland, you don't notice this as much, but if you live by the coast and the Gulf, like I do, somewhat here, what happens twice a day if you live by water? Tides. Actually, every 24 hours and a few minutes, you get tides coming in and going in. Depending on where the moon is, they may be stronger, they may be weaker. But twice a day, tides come in and out. All right, now notice Genesis chapter 8, verse 2. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So some of the water came from the rain, and some of the waters came from the fountains of the deep. In between the Americas and Europe, you have the Mid-Atlantic Trench, a big crack in the earth. Some of your flood scholars believe that during the time of the flood, the earth cracked open there. When the earth cracked open there, the waters in the sea rushed in. Magma, all of that, this water was ejected up into the upper stratosphere, fell all over the earth as rain. What does it say about the fountains of the great deep? They were broken open. That's where some of the water came from. That's what we're reading here in verse 2. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained, and the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. If you have a Hebrew, or some of you have an old Bible, especially the old wide margin Bible, if you look, it's got a little reference in the middle. Some of you might have a reference. Mine doesn't. I'm using the King James, the New King James. But it says, the waters were in going and returning. So what would that mean? For 150 days, you had the waters covering the earth, and then the water started to recede off the earth, and they would come back and forth, back and forth. How often? How often do you have tides? So every day you would have hundreds of feet of water washing over the continental shelf, and then the 12 hours going back the other way. The earth was scoured clean, brother. That's why we don't find anything of the pre-flood world, very little, because it was all scoured clean. And what happens here, in going and returning, the earth was covered by large sheets of strata. So this water going back and forth, carrying this mud and silt, would lay down strata and strata and strata and strata back and forth until it became where the water wasn't all the way over the earth. So now we have water coming over in sheets, and it's taking it's eroding the strata that's being laid down. That's now soft. And so there you got some of these canyons and things that are formed. In the mouth of the Hudson Bay River that feeds the Great Lakes, there's a canyon below it that's deeper than the Grand Canyon. We don't see it because it's covered by water. But as the water was coming off the area there by the Great Lakes, it was scouring out that canyon. And then little by little, it filled up when the mountains rose up and the valley sank down. Now it's covered by water. So the strata that formed was caused by this water, 150 days, coming back and forth over the earth for as long as it took. What happens with all these dead animals the strata beds were formed. So we have strata of fossils formed all over the United States and all Europe, everywhere else. Marine fossils are found on all the world's mountains. All of them. All of them. Marine fossils and seashells have been found on the top of all of the world's mountains, including the Rocky Mountains. Here is a picture of an oyster shell. Oyster shells are very common on the top of the Rocky Mountains. They're found on the top of the Appalachians. Now, they're not found so much on the top of the Appalachians because they were on the top of the Appalachians and then something scoured off the top of the Appalachians. Some water event. What's big enough to scour off the top of the Appalachians. And some of that sediment is found in Colorado. It comes from the top of the top of the Appalachians. The Appalachians are an older mountain chain that has been ground down by water. The Rocky Mountains are new. During the time that these mountains were rising, this all occurred. Marine fossils have been found on the top of Mount Everest. People go up to Mount Everest, they bring back rocks, they break them up, they analyze them, and they find little marine fossils in it. The marine fossils originally lived in water that was 400 meters deep. So the top of Mount Everest was once 400 meters below the surface of the water, because that's the only place that these type of marine fossils grow. They have to grow under large depths of water. So what happened is the Mount Everest wasn't covered by water. What happened is Mount Everest was formed by the flood, and it became Mount Everest after the flood. When the mountains rose up, Mount Everest was created through whatever processes that you want to look at. So one of the things that proves a flood is that on all the mountains of all the world, all of them that have not been eroded away, there are marine fossils on all of them, which indicates that, and most of your mountains are made up of sedimentary rock, which is rock that was laid down by water. We have two choices, and this is where we really leave the young earth creations behind in our interpretation of the scriptures and geology. We have two possibilities. One is that the strata was formed by the flood of Noah, 150 days and all of that stuff, and then the mountains rose up, lifting up the strata. Some of the strata has bends in it, which means it was soft. Or we had the strata laid down by the flood of Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, the pre-Adamic flood. And then this strata was lifted up and became the mountains. Let's look at some continuing effects of the earth by the flood. Large strata beds of sedimentary rock formed. Now, I want you remember we talked about not seeing the forest for the trees? Think about this. Sedimentary rock, which is rock that's formed by water depositation, sedimentary rock covers 75% of the Earth's continents. I didn't say of the world, I said of the continents. So of the continental land masses, the surface of North America, the surface of Asia, the surface of Africa, 75% of the rocks are sedimentary rock. Here's a picture of the United States. Sedimentary rock is all this colored in kind of a brown right here. This is not sedimentary rock, this is not. But most of North America is covered by sedimentary rock. Where did this sedimentary rock come from? It came from water that laid down the rock. Now, another thing to consider. 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. So you've got 70% of the Earth's surface that's covered by water, and you've got 75% of the Earth's exposed crust that's covered by sedimentary rock, which was rock reworked by water. You don't see a flood there somewhere? The flood reshaped the earth. Now consider some things. Let's do a little math. 70% of the earth is covered by water, right? 75% of the continents are covered by sedimentary rock, right? So you take, that means that of the 70%, that 30% of it is covered as the continents, right? So we take 30% here and multiply it by 75%, we got 23%. So 23% of the earth is covered by sedimentary rock. You add 70 and 23% together, and you have 93%. 93% of the Earth's surface has been reworked and laid down by water or is water. Now, if that doesn't tell you there's a flood somewhere, then there's no proof that it can ever convince you. We're not seeing the forest for the trees. We live in an Earth that's full of water, that the sedimentary rocks laid down by the water, and we say, I don't think there was a flood. You know, if you go to NASA, and you go and you start investigating the Martian probes that have gone to Mars, the NASA astronauts and all of these planetary astronauts and all these ex-solar planetary scientists, they're all going gaga. We're trying to find water. If we find water, then there's life. Well, they look at Mars, and Mars shows evidence of having been covered by water because there are streams and stuff. There's geological epochs in the Martian scenario, and one of them has been named the Noachian era because of the tiny little bits of evidence that there's been water there. Well, if they're going to name, you know, a few million years of water on Mars as being the Noachian period, what should you do with the Earth that's got all of this? To me, that's proof that there's been a flood. Now, the flood changed the Earth. Here's how the flood changed the Earth. The mountains rose up. We talked about that. Most of your mountains have rose up by the flood. Some of your older mountains, like the Appalachians, were probably pre-flood, smaller. What is God going to do during the millennium? Make a threshing tool that what? Grinds down the mountains. We live in a world that's full of mountains, brother. There's deserts. Because one side of the mountain, the water can't get there because of prevailing winds and the clouds can't carry the water over the mountains. So on one side you have California, on the other side you have the Sierra Nevadas. So deserts are formed by the flood, which is what caused the mountains to rise up. The ice caps were created in the scenario I just gave you a few minutes ago. The wind systems began. If you have cold at the top and cold at the bottom, polar, Antarctic. Anta means opposite. So you got the Arctic ice caps and the opposite Arctic ice caps. And they're cool up here and cool up here, and the sun is warming the middle. What's going to happen? They're going to try to equalize. So you remember when you were in school and you had this chart that showed the wind systems? The wind systems are caused by the ice caps. If there was no ice caps, there would be no wind systems. And the ice caps are caused by the flood. So we live in a world that's windy because of the flood. Continents were formed and divided. Talked about Pele and how the water rose up and divided the continents. The climate change. The pre-flood Earth was more tropical, no great variations. They find palm trees and tropical fossils by the ice caps. Sedimentary rock formed in the flood of Genesis 1. So we have the sedimentary rock formed in the first catastrophe. We had a Bible study about the pre-flood world, about the pre-Adamic world, and about the catastrophes that occurred then. The sedimentary rock formed in the flood of Genesis 1, which was sitting there on the top of the continental land masses, that was reworked by the flood waters of Genesis chapter 6. So we have a dump of strata built upon a dump of strata. That's why it's very difficult to interpret. Effects of the flood on living things. We had a lowering of the atmospheric pressure. We had a lowering of the atmospheric oxygen levels. All this we covered in the past Bible studies. Genetic changes to man, mutations, hormone change-up and all of that. Changes in the ozone balance and the amount of the atmosphere. The wind systems caused the ozone that was up in the upper stratosphere to now be in the lower atmosphere. And we breathe in ozone every once in a while. Ozone is carcinogenic, causes cancer and all kinds of toxic problems. Changes in the composition of nutrients in the food and plants. Nutrients are transported through water, through plants. You change up water, wind, plants, you change up nutrients. Effect of the flood on us. We covered this last time, but in Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11, we looked at the pre-flood longevity, and we looked at the post-flood longevity. And people before the flood lived for a long, long time, and people after the flood lived for a very short time in comparison. What happened in between the flood? The flood changed the mechanism for aging. So you and I are living to 60, 70, if we're lucky, 80, 90 years. What would it have been like to live to 900 years? That changed because of the flood. Flood caused the division of mankind via geological and water division. So the earth was physically divided by rising water. All right? And what did that cause? It caused mankind to have different languages and hence different cultures. Let's go to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. Genesis 11, verse 5. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Remember the Tower of Babel. Verse 6, and the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. Now let me give you something to think about. The internet is basically given us one language. Think of all the things that have happened since then. What would happen if we all spoke exactly the same language and could understand each other exactly the way we're supposed to? They all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. God had a timetable for people after the flood, and he wanted them to disperse because there was prophecies and certain things that had to be worked out. And if the people didn't disperse and spoke one language, then they were going to be able to do the things we're doing now. Verse 7, come, let us go down and there confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building. Therefore the name is called Babel. Babel means confusion. Babbler. What's this babbler going to say next? Because that the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. What he couldn't do by asking, y'all need to colonize the world, he did by force, language-wise. Confounded their languages, they didn't get together. Cultures and races, to a certain extent, are built around languages. Because you associate, you intermarry and have marriages with people that speak the same language with you, most of the time. And so therefore, the division of the languages caused races and cultures to develop, which gives us all the different cultures we have. That was caused by the flood. Genesis chapter 6, verse 13 and 17, God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So the earth, once again, was destroyed. So one of the things I want you to understand, brethren, if you don't get anything else out of this Bible study, is you need to understand that the world that we're living in now is completely different than the world that the patriarchs before the flood lived in. Adam and Eve lived in a different world than you and I are living in. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is in the earth shall die. Here's our two divisions of the kind of animals that are going to be on the ark. Breath of life, and you live on the earth. Land living, air breathing, and sorted by kinds. 2 Peter, for this they willingly forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded by water. So we have a New Testament scripture. We have several Old Testament scriptures that tell us all the same thing. That the earth was destroyed, that it perished, that it was different. The flood changed the earth, and because the flood changed the earth, it changed mankind. The earth before the flood was different. The earth after the flood is different. We are awaiting, and before you think I'm being melodramatic, we are awaiting what? The millennial world that is coming. Is it going to be different? Yes, it is. It's going to be different too. And then after the millennial world comes the new heavens and the new earth, which is going to be a completely total world. So we're living in one of the worlds that God has fashioned for us through the actions of the flood. Photo credits for all my photos in there. And I'll be posting this online in the next couple of days. And here's my works cited. And does anybody before we conclude, does anybody have any questions or comments about anything? Yes, ma'am.
How did they get fresh water?
How did they get fresh water? From who's they?
On a boat.
On the boat, they preloaded it in cisterns. Let me show you. Let's see if I can.
The filtration system?
No, the fresh water, they preloaded it before the flood.
I imagine they probably got some from the rain too.
Yeah, but it was all preloaded. Let me see if I can.
The tower,
I think I saw
the water tower.
Yeah. Let me get out of the slideshow. Let's see if I can. Now, here's another thing to consider about the water. Hold on. There is a method to my madness if I can get this thing to work. There we go. You see the cistern right there? Some people say that there was holes in the roof and the water would fill up the cistern. But another thing too is, another question sort of like this is, you have the freshwater fish and the saltwater fish. How do they survive? Saltwater and freshwater do not mix. Now, if you have an ocean and you have a river and they're coming together, salt water is denser than freshwater, so the salt water will layer. And you can have miles above the salt water where there are sharks and things like trout living. And if you vary the salt water little by little, then most of your freshwater fish and your saltwater fish can live in water that is different than the one they're in. So the water didn't intermix. There was probably hundreds of square miles of water out in the ocean that had freshwater fish in it. And then when the water started coming off of the oceans, some of these freshwater fish would get deposited back on land and into streams and things like that. We can only guess though. But freshwater was carried into cisterns, and it was carried into. They could preload the food, they could preload everything into the ark before the flood began. So they probably didn't have to load anything. They didn't need anything after the flood started. So you remember we looked at the carrying capacity of the ark? Carrying capacity of the ark for 40,000 animals was about a third of the ark, which is one deck. Deck 1, deck 2 could all be used for food, water, you know. Where did Noah get the wood and the nails and the things that he needed after the flood began? You're going to go to another planet on a spaceship. What are you going to take with you? You're going to take nails, books, the computers, all this stuff that you're going to need in the new world. That's what Noah did. Noah took all of this stuff, including water and food. Other question? You had another question?
At the bottom right corner, are those rocks? What kind of rocks are those?
Oh, these right here, these are ballast. It's just the Bible doesn't say that the ark had ballast, but all large ships have ballast.
What is ballast again?
Ballast is weights that make the ship sink so that it's more stable.
Oh, I see.
And the Romans used to put wine. They used to put big clay jars with wine, and the ballast was then sold when they got to where they were going. A lot of your ships, like the Mayflower and things like that, they had rocks in the bottom to make it. Some people put timber in there, but rocks would make the ship sink, so it would be more stable. The more that's in the water, the more stable it is. So that was ballast. So all ships had ballast. The ark doesn't say, the Bible doesn't say, but if you want to be nautically correct, you had ballast in it.
Boats you actually use water as ballast.
Yeah, and I would imagine that probably Noah would have put timber in there, would have put metal. You know, I mean, you're going to use your space for something. So Noah would have used that space for carrying whatever he needed in the next world. You have to liken the Ark of Noah to going to another world, and there's nothing that there's nothing to be there when you get there. So you bring everything with you. They would have brought nails. He would have brought iron. He would have brought, because it would have been several years before they would have been able to manufacture iron, nails, things like that. Well, they could have, but it would have taken them years to make up
They would have needed to grow trees before they have wood.
They would have needed. They probably brought over these things that manufacture metal. What do you call them? Furnaces. Metal making furnaces. They brought over small ones and things like that. They were very intelligent. They were not, you know, they didn't just, you know, people making a boat. He was a very, very smart man. Yes, sir.
Most people don't know it, I don't think, but in Solomon's day, he ran freight liners all over the world.
It says that in
Shipped
three,
all over the world.
it took his ships 3 years to make a voyage. That's how long it takes to circumnavigate the globe in a sailing ship. And he brought back peacocks and all kinds of things, which were from Africa and different countries. And there's some people
And all
that
kinds of
say that
lumber.
in the United States, there's mines where the Hebrews came over and mined copper and gold, and they found commandments written on various rock structures in Hebrew. So some people say that the Hebrew people that were in the Solomon's time, and the Phoenicians and King Tyrus, who was a great sailor, his people were great sailors, came over to the New World and mined, and then left. And you know, so people were very intelligent. They were not. Any other questions? Yes.
What caused the mountains to rise up? I mean, like physically, what would cause it? Would it be the pressure of the water?
Okay, here's a couple of things, and I don't have a chart with me, but there's a couple of ideas. One is the flood was tidal in nature. In other words, the water just didn't appear from the clouds and all that. Let me put it this way: if you have the earth here, okay, and you have another body that passes by the earth, and these are just theories. This is not biblical, but we don't know the answers. But this and $1 will get you a cup of coffee. But this is what some people say, and I've done a lot of research. I think it's probably true. A planet came by near the earth and revolved around the earth, and then it went back. Now, before we go into the planet revolving around the earth, consider something. If I have a motor in a vacuum, I have a motor in a vacuum, and it's weightless out in space, and this motor's turning at a certain angle, it's got a magnetic field around it. Okay, this magnetic field, if I put another motor like it next to it, the magnetic field will start this other motor turning. And pretty soon they're turning in the same speed and in the same tilt. That's what's going to happen when you put two motors together in a vacuum. Mars has a day that's 23 and a few minutes long. 23 hours and a few minutes long. I think it's either a little bit, a few minutes longer than ours, or a few minutes shorter than ours. But Mars has the same tilt, and it has the same length of day. So some people believe that Mars, and you remember in your mythology, Mars was the god of what? War. And she had Mars battled who? Terra, the Earth. So Mars came out of its orbit because of the interaction of Jupiter, came out of its orbit, circled the Earth a couple of times, and then went back to its orbit that it's in. When this body, whether it's Mars or anything else, went around the Earth, when it went around the Earth, this body pulls tidally and gravitationally the inside of the magma. When it pulls the magma this way, the crust cracks. All right? Now, you have the Earth spinning, and the Earth is spinning, and it's oblate spheroid. It's a flat sphere. It's not perfectly round like this. It's kind of flat like this, and it's because it's spinning. And if the Earth is spinning like this, and the axis is going to change, well, let's say that the axis was up and down before the flood, and the axis is going to change, and it changes this way, then what would happen is you would have now a new centrifugal force not being applied here, but being applied here, which would cause you to have cracks on the other side of the Earth. The cracks on the other side of the Earth were the cracks of the Mid-Atlantic Trench, where the water went in and went up. And then on the other side of Africa, where you have the equator, you would get new cracks. This is the cracks in Africa where the Leakeys are digging up all their fossils. So the Leakeys are digging up the fossils, proving evolution from cracks that were formed during the flood of Noah. That's how history is different. But so what would happen? You asked about, what did you ask about?
The mountains. What caused the mountains?
The mountains to rise were caused by the interaction of these two
and the
astronomical
cracks
bodies.
and then the plasma. I mean, not the plasma.
The magma. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be hot, so that would cause the mountain to come up.
But what I think happened is the mountains were caused by the tidal gravitational forces of an object near us. We don't know.
That's
We don't know.
okay.
The people that, the scientists and geologists say that the mountains are caused by the plate tectonics. And the plate tectonics run into each other and they form crinkles, and this causes the mountains. Plate tectonics is absolutely correct, but they have the time scale wrong. In other words, plate tectonics, you remember the scripture where it says in Revelation, where it says, and the mountains fled away? Okay, you have and you remember when you had the tsunami that struck Japan about 5 or 6 years ago?
Yeah.
And they measured Japan, and they said that Japan had moved so many meters from its present position. Japan is caused by, it's on a plate, and the magma coming up is what's caused Japan. So they're magma mountains, what Japan is. They're volcanic islands. And so this volcanic islands are sitting on a plate right here, because the magma's coming up here and making Japan. Well, when this magnetic plates moved, Japan moved. So Japan is now 3 meters or 10 inches or whatever it is. We don't know, some minuscule amount. In the Bible it says that, he saw the little the mountains like little rams skipping. And he said that all the mountains fled away on that day, and the men are going to hide in the caves and dens of the earth. The mountains are all on tectonic plates. When Jesus Christ returns, there's going to be so much tectonic activity that the plates are going to move and the mountains are going to move with them. It says all the mountains and every island fled away. The volcanic islands that are on there are going to flee away when these plates move at 70, 80 miles an hour. So I believe that during the flood, plate tectonics was in effect, because what happened when this crack here formed, when the cracks formed, what happened is the earth started, the crust started going in like this. It started going like this, it moved the continents. So I think the continents were moving at several hundred feet per second. Several hundred feet per hour for probably days. And what we have now with this, half a centimeter every 10 years, and in a gazillion years we'll have mountains. We have the same process, just speeded up by millions of times. So I think the plate tectonics is, what we have now is the leftover breakings. Like you're stopping a car, like the brakes being applied, and now plate tectonics is slowing down. It wasn't always that fast. It was actually faster in the past, in my opinion. So that's where I think the mountains came. The mountains came because the earth was going through all of these gyrations. And when the great fountains of the earth broke open, there's a lot of people believe there's a lot of water underground. The water came up to the surface. That, you got water, and you got water all around it. When the water comes up this way, that makes this area suck in. When this area sucks in, it crinkles the crust. A lot of different processes, but that's what I believe. Any questions? Very good. Okay, if y'all will bow your heads, I'll go ahead and close with prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we are so thankful to you because you have given us your scriptures, and you have not left us in the dark about what happened in the past. Although there are many things we do not and cannot find out, you've left us enough whereby in faith we can believe in you and believe that the books of Genesis are correct, and that you actually did do through Noah what you said you did. Thank you very much for giving us the understanding and for allowing us to build our faith. Please be with us in the coming week. Protect and guide us. Bring us back safely next week. Be with those of us that are traveling. Help us to get to where we need to go. And once again, we thank you for your Bible, for all the truth it gives us, for all the understanding it gives us. We ask this all and thank you for everything. In and through Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
You were saying that the internet has made us have one language. There's even an app where if you speak like in English, you can translate to where it'll speak for you.
Yeah.
In the language.
You can have a little thing. Remember when you were seeing Star Trek? You had this little thing. You just spoke and it translated.
Yeah.
They're going to have those in a few years.
You actually have, you
Or
can
Doctor
actually,
Who.
you can do that on the iPhone. Just talk to it.
Yeah, I want something. I think we put.
No, let me the piece of.
I want something.
Universal translator.
Universal translator.
I'm waiting for thing on.
I know some people that think they're a universal translator. Grace. Whoa! Woo!
I installed new kitchen lights.
Oh yeah?
Every time I go to the kitchen, it's like, wow.
He doesn't have a grand-
We don't know how it happened, but there's various. In other words, what I want you to do is don't think that you're dumb because you believe the Bible.
Oh, no.
The Bible is a very, very interesting and scientifically based book.
Go pick up all your stuff, okay, we're
I
gonna
don't know,
go.
that God is so great, and he just says, like,
Orly.
if you work it.
Here you go.
I think it's so extensive.
We're not going back. Okay. We're not going, I usually go to the one in.
Would you mind bringing that down and take that